Something happens near the end of your story to release the tension that has built up around the struggle with the story problem. This is called the climax to your story. In the climax, there's some sort of resolution to the story problem. Now, this resolution in the climax could make for a happy ending to the story, or it could make for less than happy ending. And sometimes you may want to consider having a less than happy ending, as it could illustrate your story implication more strongly. First, you will have a much stronger story if the climax includes some element of surprise. The surprise could be in what happened, or it could be in how it happened, or in where, why, who, or when. If the climax is totally obvious, you will probably leave less of an impression with your audience. An element of surprise engages our emotions more strongly. Second, make sure that your climax, how the story problem is resolved, actually supports your story implication. What might be the climax to your story? You will want to think of many different possibilities to find the strongest one. In the last few lessons, we've talked about the ending of your story. That's the main point. We talked about the climax, the story problem, and we talked about the beginning, which is the opening. But how do you connect the beginning to the climax while keeping your audience's attention? What needs to happen in the middle of your story? Let's think about the pattern of a story. What happens in the middle? If you think about it, what is going on here is a series of unfolding details. These details create tension and release tension. They raise a question, they answer a question, then raise another question, and answer that particular question. And this is all keeping in mind the suspense is going on while setting up the climax, the main point of the story. People keep paying attention because they have a sense of what these details matter, but they're not yet sure why. People keep paying attention because they have a sense that this is going somewhere, but they're not sure where it's going to end up or how it's going to get there. It's like an unfolding mystery. So as you think through the series of unfolding details that might be in the middle of your story, you will need to strike a balance of how much detail you include. If you have too few details or too many details, your audience will lose interest, but for different reasons. Each story is a journey with a beginning and an end, and we need the steps in the middle to connect with one another, to provide that path to get from here to there. If you have too few details, your audience will lose interest because your story will be hard to follow. You're probably skipping steps that are very critical, and people will get lost on the journey. If you have too many details, your audience will lose interest because there's just too much unnecessary information that doesn't really help them understand the main point you're building towards. You might bore them. You might irritate them because they feel they're wasting their valuable time. Or you might overwhelm them in some way where they're no longer able to focus on the most important part of your story. Now we're going to do an exercise that will help you think about what happens in your story and how your story parts connect. This is an exercise that is best done with index cards or post-it notes, or you can improvise with small pieces of paper. For the purpose of explaining this exercise, let's assume you're using index cards. First index card, summarize the ending of your story implication. Keep it short, not more than 2 sentences. Draw a picture to help you think visually. Second, on another index card, summarize the beginning of your story. What is the story problem you're starting with? Again, keep it short, not more than 2 sentences, and draw a picture. Third, summarize the climax. Keep it short, draw a picture. Now, brainstorm what steps in the middle might be needed to connect the beginning to the climax. List all the ideas that come to mind and write each idea on a separate index card. Put your beginning index card on one side of the table and put your ending story implication index card on the other side of the table. Put the climax card next to the ending story implication card. Then start trying to build a path of supporting points, choosing from the middle steps that you brainstormed. Play around with which steps you use and what order you put them in. Keep rearranging these things to explore different journeys you can take to get from the beginning to the end. Try creating different journeys that are no more than 6 cards total. You'll have 3 cards for your beginning, climax, and ending story implication. So you can have up to 3 cards for the middle of your story. As you explore this, there are different things that can happen. You might find that there are steps that you brainstormed that are not really necessary to connect the beginning to the end. You can eliminate those steps. You might find that there are steps missing, and you may need to figure out what those steps are. You might find that there are too many steps needed to get from the beginning to the end, and that you may need to cover less ground in your story. You might also find that your story beginning, climax, or ending story implication are not quite working, and this needs to be revised. Or you might just find something else. Use this exercise to play around with your story quickly before you start actually drafting your story script word for word. Great stories rarely come on the first draft. This card technique will enable you to play with many different versions of your story quickly and to help you find the strongest story you can create. Set your timer for at least 1 hour. Play around with your story possibilities and come up with at least 5 different versions of how your story could unfold. The good news is, you already have most of your storyboard from the exercise in the previous video. The results of the card exercise can be seen as a first draft of a storyboard. You're simply adding more detail, such as what is happening in each shot, what is being said, and or what titles and graphics might be seen.